Anthropologist defines culture as the way and life of a people. Many scholars within the field of anthropologist suggest that culture evolves over time. Deal and Peterson, 2009. With the above stated arguments, the suggestion of the Caribbean having a unique and defined culture is not far-fetched. The Caribbean region shares a common history. The Caribbean region experienced a history which involved conquests, wars and slavery. Regardless of the language barriers which exist amongst several Caribbean countries, the culture of history are similar. Higman, 2011. How can we best argue for or against the view that the Caribbean having a unique and defined culture? The history of most Caribbean islands is similar in context. The history of the Caribbean begins with limited availability of recorded information on the Taínos whom occupied the Caribbean region prior to the occupation of the Europeans. Archaeologists and anthropologists theorize that between 13,000 and 16,000 years ago the sea along the Bering Straits was frozen. They further theorize that the people who lived within this time were nomads. They traveled pursuit of wild animals for food. The travel of these nomads to them into the Americas, across Central America down into South America and hopscotch several islands using canoes in search for food and means of survival. The Europeans came to the Caribbean several hundreds of years after this journey. They came to the Caribbean after these nomads, now referred to as Taínos, became stationary in the Caribbean. These began fishing, farming and hunting as a means of survival. Their civilization, according to Columbus logs/Terry, suggested that they were sophisticated in their survival techniques. These practiced mixed cultivation, irrigation and learned and mastered the art of making utensils from clay. Higman, 2011. The diverse menu of these people was offered to the Europeans as they landed on many Caribbean shores across the region. Today the practice of making utensils is regarded as art, but the use of the irrigation technique is still considered a brilliant idea. Here we have identified a common history amongst the Caribbean people. Indeed, both the Taínos and the Spanish occupied most if not all the islands in the Caribbean at one point in time. As the discovery of the islands in the Western Hemisphere became public knowledge, other countries sought to explore the Western Hemisphere. The Dutch, French and English sought to overthrow the Spanish conquest in the Caribbean. Several wars occurred both at sea and on the shores of many Caribbean islands as Europe sought claim on the Caribbean. The invasion of the Europeans of the Caribbean resulted in the introduction of several other languages other than that of the Taínos and the Spanish. The culture of the Taínos evolves to accommodate the Spanish language and way of life. Although many argue that the Taínos were enslaved by the Spaniards, their culture did not remain pure, it evolved into a different dimension. Other European later came and further added to the complexity of the language situation which was in existence. The way of life of the Taínos was now being gradually eroded. The power of the village chief and traditional ceremonies gradually became obsolete. The Spanish way of life was regarded as superior. The Spanish remained the main European power in the Caribbean for nearly 200 years, from 1492 to 1665. In 1665 the British decided to challenge the Spanish for sections of the Caribbean. Being outnumbered in many claimed colonies, the Spanish gave up without much fight. The French and the Dutch also sought a hold on some colonies owned by the Spanish. They too were successful. These included St. Lucia and Haiti. The amalgamation of these European colonies throughout the Caribbean created a mixed cultural pot. One region having several cultural backgrounds. It was the Dutch whom introduced the idea of the slave trade and the cultivation of sugar on a large scale to the British. This was introduced after the natives of the region could not withstand the harsh treatment of their European masters. The British considered their options. They opted to try the Dutch idea of large-scale cultivation with slave labor from Africa. Slavery became popular in the Caribbean in the late 1600s. Africans were shipped from Africa to work within the Caribbean on large plantations. Du Bois, 1915, and Bloet 2007. With the introduction of the Africans in the Caribbean came an additional cultural dimension. Language, dress, religion, social and family life differed from the European standards. Religion imported from the African continent was referred to as voodoo and witchcraft by the European, while religion from Europe were looked upon as the favored type. The ingredients of the Caribbean way of life began thousands of years before the Europeans came to the Caribbean and became more complex with the introduction of varied cultural ideals from several other countries. Africans working on large sugar plantations created a unique language referred to as patois. This language was necessary because of the different African language which existed. Each group of Africans had a unique language, however working on the sugar plantation resulted in several Africans working together from several different tribes. This language, patois, was created in English, Dutch, French and Spanish along Caribbean colonies throughout the Caribbean. They also use varying dances and means of expressions as a means of communicating to each other. Hidman 2011 and Burton, 1985. Culture differs within the Caribbean for several different reasons. Let's look at language. Today the people in the Caribbean speak several Creole language, same as patois. They also share different cultural practices unique to their colonial masters. This solidifies the idea that the culture within the Caribbean is not tied with language. With the varied cultural background found throughout the Caribbean come varied practices of the people found within this region. This can be seen clearly when indentureship began in the Caribbean and planters in the regions imported workers from Asia to fill the void left by African workers. The Chinese, Indians and other Asian-based individuals brought with them varied style of dress, region, food and way of life. Up until this point the defined culture of the people has not been made clear. This undefined Caribbean culture still today remain vague with little similarity amongst all Caribbean states. It is however correct to suggest that the Caribbean by virtue of location has a unique culture. The Caribbean islands' position in the tropics results in a common weather condition experience. All Caribbean islands experienced a common history, conquest, plunder, slavery and colonial rule. The indoctrination of the Caribbean colonies by their colonial masters facilitated a unique history, shaped and formed by the Europeans. Should history be rewind and the conquest of the Caribbean never becoming a fairy tale, the passing of cultural practice from one generation to the next would facilitate a unique inherent culture. This episode within the Caribbean epistle would mark a true Caribbean culture. The arguments suggesting a non-existence of a Caribbean culture is valid. The multicultural experience which exists throughout the region makes it difficult to argue otherwise. Culture is viewed as the way and life of a people. Throughout the Caribbean norms vary from island to island. The degree of value placed on several folkways is different. People throughout the Caribbean mirror the norms of their colonial masters. Throughout the Caribbean, many islands switched colonial masters over the years, making cultural differences even more complex. It would be unfair however to view the point of one culture by virtue of location and history. These are serious arguments which if looked at carefully may create a valued argument for a Caribbean culture. However, to suggest a multicultural Caribbean region would be academically and historically correct. Indeed, the Caribbean's history determined its cultural status.